Welcome to this video about pawn structure play in step 3. When I did the overview video about positional play in step 3, I was discussing vulnerability and activity, but I realized that there was so much information in that video that it would be good just to pay attention to one element, and today the element is pawn structure. So in step 3, as part of vulnerability, you learn how to damage the pawn structure of your opponent and how to improve your own pawn structure by undoubling pawns, for instance. And finally, I'd like to give some attention to when is actually a damaged pawn structure weak. And it has to do whether the damaged pawns can actually be attacked, and of course what the piece activity is, and other dynamics in the position after the damaging of the pawn structure. So let's have a look. This is the first position. White can damage the pawn structure of black by advancing the c pawn, and after b takes e6, bishop takes a6. Right, we see what has changed. The white bishop has been activated, the black pawn structure has been damaged, but in addition, suddenly white has a passed pawn on the a file. So after king e7, white is actually able to already start advancing their pawns, because after bishop e3, a5, black will have to give up a piece to avoid the promotion of the a pawn, and white is winning. So in this position, let's orient ourselves. Black is to move, and if we look at this position, right, we see that the white king is on c1, and it's kind of exposed. The other thing we notice is that this pawn is undefended, and so this pawn chain, right, can be questioned, right, and you can question it in two ways: on the by questioning b4 or by questioning c5. And in this case, after b6, black is winning, because after c takes b6, bishop takes b4, the knight on c3 is hanging, and in the future black is going to win the pawn on b6, and suddenly you can see again the bishop activity has been increased by the elimination of the pawns. So there's a direct link, and white is going to win an additional pawn and have a strong attack. Once again, let's have a look here. White is to move. If you look at this position, we see, right, that black played g5, and because of g5, the pawn on f5 is no longer defended, and we can undermine this pawn structure by playing the move g4, and after f takes g4, h takes g4, the pawn on e4 can no longer be defended, and we just take the pawn, and this also makes the square d3 available for the king after a move like rook h2. So again, we saw a move that undermines the pawn structure of the opponent, leading to a win of an activation of a piece and a win of a pawn, a gain of a pawn. So let's have a look at this position, right? So the black is to move, and this resembles, for instance, a position that can occur in the Scandinavian. And in this position, right, sometimes you have pieces that have a dual defending role. The bishop on e2 is defending the pawn on c4 and is defending the knight on f3, and black can damage the pawn structure by taking on f3, and if white plays g takes f3, then the pawn structure in front of the white king has been damaged, and after bishop takes f3 there's knight takes c4, and also now just black wins a pawn, but in addition, of course, suddenly the pawn on d4 has become isolated, and black can start targeting that pawn by first blockading it and then starting to attack it with multiple pieces. Another nice example. So here we see this pawn structure. And we can undermine this pawn structure. This time we don't do it by attacking f6, but we are chasing the bishop. The bishop has to move. We play h6, threatening to take on g7 with the pawn. And of course also you can see already that the bishop is getting activated. So g takes f6, bishop takes f6, is attacking the rook on h8. Rook h8 goes to g8. And now we see the weakness of those two pawns. We can start attacking them immediately with rook h1. And after rook g6, bishop b2. Imagine that black says, I'm going to attack the backward pawn on g3. We can easily defend it. And after bishop e8, we have bishop h5. And so what is again confirmed is that if we are able to move pawns, we are activating the bishops in this case, because look at this bishop, and the rook on g6 will be lost against a bishop. So white is winning an exchange on top of the earlier material gain. So let's have a look here, right? So knight e4, queen d3, knight takes c3, b takes c3. And now what we see is that the pawn structure of white has been damaged, and black can start targeting to attack the pawn on c4 with bishop a6 and with knight, for instance, knight a5 and with rook c8. So this pawn will be lost, and in addition, of course, if we look to the squares, c5 is now a square that can no longer be challenged by a pawn. So there's also a link between, you could say, strong squares and a weakened pawn structure. In this case, c5 has become untouchable for white pawns. So black is to move in this position. Can you see a way for black to damage the pawn structure of white? Right, and so in this case, black can play bishop a5, and white cannot defend, because after rook e3, black would play d4 with a double attack of the pawn. So that's not a possibility. Right, and let's say that white just plays a move like this. We damage the pawn structure, and now we can start targeting this pawn on c3 by bringing our knight, by bringing our rook to the half-open file, and black has the better position. So let's look from the other side. So far we discussed only examples about weakening the opponent's pawn structure, but we also would like to improve our pawn structure if possible. So in this case, black is to move, and black has two double pawns, and white has a outside pass pawn. So the pawn play in this example would be to play c4, and if the bishop takes c4, bishop takes a4, we exchanged one of our double pawns for the dangerous outside passer, and we achieved equality with black. So we can trade pawns that are less valuable and improve our pawn structure like this. Or there's also other ways to improve our pawn structure. So white is to play here. If you look to the white pawn structure, has been damaged, right? But white can improve their pawn structure by playing the move queen d4, right? So this is a double attack. It's attacking the queen on c5, and it's attacking the knight on e5, and black can not do anything else than to trade the queens. The knight is under attack. The knight needs to move away, and then we also notice that this pawn on c7 is under attack by the bishop. So white improved their pawn structure by getting rid of the double pawns on the c-file, the isolated double pawns, and at the same time activated the bishop and is winning the pawn on c7. So I'd like to just highlight this last point about damaging the pawn structure is only weak, a damaged pawn structure, if it can be attacked successfully. So let's have a look at the following opening, which is of course very common. So we have an Italian game, and here I'd just like to mention, right, if we look at this position and we say what is going on here, right? In this position, if you look at the games in the mega database, 261 times bishop b6 was played, and in 63 times bishop takes e3 was played. So if we look to the performance of the two moves, right, after bishop b6, white scores 44%, and after bishop takes e3, white scores 65%, so much higher. And you could say, but black is damaging the pawn structure of white. But now we get to the question: can it be successfully be attacked? Right. So after bishop takes e3, f takes e3. This pawn can be attacked one more time with knight g4, but it can easily be defended by a move like queen e1 or queen e2. So, and then black is unable to add additional attackers, and white can force the knight back with a move like h3. So why is this not very good for black, right? It's not a bad move, because you can see it's still played in 61 games. But what is the trade-off? So in this position, white has additional control over the squares d4 and f4, and I have open f-file for the rook, and this is very beneficial for white and compensates for the fact that white has a double pawn on the e-file. But very important is that actually this pawn on e3 cannot successfully be attacked. So let's look at one more example. So this is in the Relopez, right? So if you would ask yourself, how easy is it for white to successfully attack the double pawns on c6 and c7? You would come to the conclusion that is not easy, and they can be easily defended. So in this position, you cannot say that c6 and c7 are weak pawns, despite the fact that they have been doubled. But there is one element related to the pawn structure that is important to mention. If we would take off all the pieces and we look at this position, white is winning. And why is white winning in this position? Because white can create a passed pawn on the king side, and black is unable to create a passed pawn on the queen side. So white will create a passed pawn on the king side, and then after that, if black continues to block, white can of course run with the king to the queen side and capture the pawns there and then win the endgame. So there's a link between, you could say, the pawn structure that we saw, where white played bishop takes c6, and black replied with d takes c6. And you can see that if it was up to white, white would trade all the pieces and go into a winning pawn ending. But in the previous position that we were looking at, black has a bishop pair, and of course black will not volunteer to trade all the pieces and will, for instance, advance the c-pawn and create counterplay in different ways. So in this case, c6 and c7 are not weak, but there is a link between strategy and the pawn structure. And as I mentioned, the pawn ending is winning, and that's why white would like to trade pieces and black would like to keep the pieces on and use their bishop pair. But let's now look from the other side. So here we have an accelerated dragon. And in this case, right, so bishop e2 is not the best move. What is considered the best move for black is to play bishop takes c3, because as we saw also previously, the pawns on c3 and c4 can be successfully attacked. And I think, of course, for step 3 student, it will be very hard to assess whether giving up this powerful bishop from g7 is sufficient compensation. But this is just to highlight the fact that that assessing whether a damaged pawn structure can be successfully attacked is important. And previously we saw that black can attack, for instance, c4 with moves like bishop a6, rook c8, queen c7, knight a5, and you could say that it's very hard for white to bring sufficient defenders to that pawn. Of course, the other side is that black has given up a bishop, and so white has to look for compensation in other ways. Final position, which is from the Najdorf. So knight f3, and now let's see if black just plays bishop e6, knight g5, bishop e7, right? So black allows white to take here. And so now the question is this pawn on e6 weak? Can it be successfully attacked? Or is it, just as we saw in the Italian, giving black an advantage because black can play d5 and it gives control over the squares d5 and f5? Well, in this case, just as we saw in the accelerated dragon, right, immediately white starts targeting that pawn. So there are now two attackers, and you can see that black is forced to defend. And of course, not all these moves are necessarily the black's best moves, but this is just an indication for how it might develop. White was threatening a double attack with knight b6 on the rook on a8 and the queen on d7. So black played rook b8, but after knight b6, the queen has to give up the defense of the e6 pawn, and the e6 pawn is already falling. So what did we see today? When you think about vulnerability, you would like to exploit the vulnerability of your opponent and create them by damaging their pawn structure. That's one of the strategies. You like to reduce your own vulnerability by patching your pawn structure and improving them by undoubling. And finally, we saw that when there is a damaged pawn structure, you do have to assess whether it can be attacked and if there are other advantages. So in the Italian, we saw that it gave white half-open f-file and control over the squares d4 and f4, and that was sufficient compensation for the damaged pawn structure. We see in this Najdorf an accelerated dragon that it's actually, it can be attacked, and so damaging the pawn structure is the right strategy. Thank you for watching my video.